Before all the political, something a little bit more personal. Mr. Paul, some of your critics would say you have no political experience, that you have some very radical ideas, and that you're too much of a loose cannon to be a senator. And for Mr. Conway, maybe the opposite. Here comes another smooth-talking lawyer who wants to climb that ladder and maybe be a career politician. So could you answer those types of criticisms and why people should give you your vote as a candidate and as a person?
Mr. Conway, you have 90 seconds.
Well, Scott, thanks for the question. It's good to be here with you tonight. This race isn't about me, and this race is not about Dr. Paul. It's about the people of Kentucky. They're hurting right now in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. I mean, families are being ripped apart, worried about whether or not they can educate their kids or keep their jobs. You know, I remember talking to a hardware store owner out there on the campaign trail who told me that his hardware store is paid for, but he's been turned down for a loan 22 times in the past 18 months. And that 15 years ago, 90% of what he stocked on his shelves was made in America, and now, a decade and a half later, 95% of what he puts on his shelves is made overseas. You know, I think about the elderly woman who looked at me and said, "I'm a retired bank teller. I live on a fixed income. I can't afford a $2,000 deductible." I think about the mothers who have cried on my shoulders as I've traveled through eastern Kentucky and have told me how their daughters overdosed on OxyContin. It's about people, and it's about who would put Kentucky first. I'm asking for your vote for the United States Senate because I want to put Kentucky first.
Mr. Conway,
hopefully I've earned your trust, and it is about people. It's not about me.
My apologies, sir. Mr. Paul, you now have 90 seconds.
I think my greatest attribute is that I've never held office. I think we have too many people that go and stay for a career. People who have never been in the business world and don't know how to run a business, don't know how to meet a payroll. I think being an outsider is a wonderful attribute and something that I present often to show that there is a difference. So often we develop such bland candidates because they come and they talk in circles and they don't present solutions. They demagogue the issues. I think people are ready for straight talk. I think people are ready to recognize that our country faces grave problems, and they want someone who will seriously discuss these issues and be unafraid to present solutions. When people say, well, gosh, could that be extreme? I say, well, what's extreme is what's going on in Washington. A $2 trillion deficit is extreme. Hundreds of billions of dollars in interest on the debt is extreme. If interest rates rise to 4 to 6%, interest will consume 25% of the budget. If interest rates rise to where they were in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, interest will consume the budget. We must elect people who will tackle these problems, not people who will simply demagogue them, take things out of context, and run on something that's not real or not true. I'm proud of being an outsider, and I'm proud of the things I stand for. Term limits, balanced budget amendment, reading the bills. These hardly sound like very extreme ideas.
Mr. Paul, thank you. Mr. Conway, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Well, Dr. Paul said he's for term limits. He's for term limits, except he told a local reporter that he wouldn't apply them to himself. With all due respect, I would say that Dr. Paul's position on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and questioning fundamental provisions of it, issues I thought we settled a half a century ago, I think that's extreme. Saying that he wants to do away with the Americans with Disabilities Act, what's he saying to 12,000 new wounded veterans that we have in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, disabled veterans since 9/11? I think that's extreme to say, soldier, just take your office on the first floor. I think that's extreme.
All right, Mr. Conway, thank you very much. Our next question goes to Amanda Van Benschoten of the Kentucky Inquirer.
Mr. Paul, Mr. Conway, both of you on the campaign trail have said you're concerned about the federal deficit and that we need to reduce spending. Could you please tell me 3 specific ways you would cut spending if you're elected?
Mr. Paul, your response.
First thing we need a balanced budget amendment to force them to. Both sides have proved themselves untrustworthy, Republicans and Democrats. With a rule, they will be forced to make difficult decisions. In Kentucky, we have a balanced budget amendment, and they have to make tough decisions. That's what we need. The second thing we need is a compromise, Republicans and Democrats, to say that The entire budget is open. We can't make military spending off limits. We can't make entitlements off limits. We can't take discretionary spending off limits. The entire budget has to be looked at if we're serious about balancing the budget. 3 items. We have unspent TARP items. We have unspent stimulus items. We have $100 billion unaccounted for. The list goes on and on. Small items. We spent $2.6 million last year studying why pigs stink. The earmarks are outrageous. The waste is outrageous. Don't give me 3, give me 1,000 we could list. The waste goes on and on. We have to start, but the real part of the answer is that you have to force them to do it by law because they've proven themselves to be untrustworthy. Pay-as-you-go didn't work. Senator Bunning stood up on pay-as-you-go because they were declaring everything an emergency. Within 3 weeks, everything was an emergency. Rules will help the system. We need rules that say you have to balance the budget by law.
Mr. Conway, you have 90 seconds.
Well, that's all fine and good, but Rand Paul's solution won't help us in the short term. He says he's for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Fine, but to pass a constitutional amendment, it's going to take years to pass, and then the states have to ratify it. We have to get about the business of actually balancing budgets. Now, on this issue, here's an area where Rand Paul talks the talk, but he hasn't walked the walk. As your Attorney General, I've balanced my budget 8 times here in the last few years. I've cut nearly 30% in spending. And Rand Paul says he's going to balance the entire federal budget next year. He's just not going to tell anybody how he's going to do it this year. Well, if you balance a federal budget like that next year, you're going to end up cutting 40% in spending. If you receive Social Security benefits, your average benefit might go from something like $1,100 down to $700. I would ask you to go to my website. Go to jackconway.org. Look at the very specific proposals that I'm talking about. I'm talking about allowing Medicare to purchase in bulk, to negotiate for lower prices just the way that Medicaid and the VA can. That saves $200 billion. We need to tackle Medicare fraud. There's maybe $100 billion of that out there. You know what I support and my opponent doesn't? I support closing these offshore tax loopholes and special interest provisions that allow us to ship our jobs overseas to places like China. We can save $130 billion there. We need to get back to pay-as-you-go as we had in Clinton, and I support a bipartisan debt commission. Those are 5 specific steps right there.
Mr. Conway, thank you. Mr. Paul, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
If you're serious about balancing the budget, you have to have rules. Like I say, they've proved themselves untrustworthy. They don't obey even their own rules on pay-as-you-go. The rule goes a long way. 32 states have a balanced budget amendment. We don't know whether it takes a year, whether it takes 5 years. If the country is up in arms and goes for this, we could pass it. We could pass it like we passed term limits on the president. We passed it relatively easily in the early 50s. With regard to term limits, he's against term limits completely. I'm for mandatory term limits for everyone.
All right, Mr. Paul, thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt, but Amanda, you have a follow-up question, I understand.
A follow-up question for Dr. Paul. Can you be a little more specific about what cuts are needed in spending to help balance the budget?
Well, we mentioned $200 billion that are left over in the TARP fund. There's at least $100 billion left over in the stimulus fund. We should make private workers and federal workers' salaries comparable. We currently pay twice as much to federal workers as we pay to private workers, $120,000 to the average federal worker. Let's bring those in line with private pay. That saves $47 billion a year. Let's also shrink the federal workforce. I think there's an enormous amount of solutions for this, but we have to have the will to do it.
All right, Mr. Paul, thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Conway, you now get 30 seconds to follow up on that same question.
Well, with all due respect, I'm still listening for the specifics of how he would actually balance the budget. The 2 specifics I've heard here recently is that he supports a $2,000 deductible for Medicare, which seems callous to me, and that he has called Social Security a Ponzi scheme and he would seek to privatize it. You're looking at a future United States Senator who will never, ever balance the budget on the backs of our seniors.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Tom McKee of 9 News now has a question for Mr. Conway.
Clyde, thank you very much. Farmers throughout the Commonwealth say they're very concerned about proposed changes coming in the estate tax or the death tax on January 1st with the $1 million exemption of the 55% tax rate. Many worry that the future of the family farm is bleak and that they might be gone away with completely. With agriculture so important to Kentucky's economy, what reassurances can you give to these farmers about this very key issue?
Well, I understand, Tom, I understand the Commonwealth of Kentucky very well, and I understand the fact that we have about 80,000 farms in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And you know what? I'm an independent Kentucky Democrat. I've broken with my party where appropriate. As Attorney General, I've taken on the pharmaceutical companies. I've taken on the oil companies. I even had to take on my governor on the occasional issue. And on the issue of taxes, I'm not like a lot of typical Democrats. I've said that in a time of recession, it's no time to be raising taxes. So let's extend the Bush tax cut provisions, and let's extend the provisions regarding the estate tax. Small family farms and small businesses throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky need to have some assurance from the federal tax code that they can pass down a family business or pass down a family farm to the next generation. That's the essence. That's the essence of what Kentucky is about. And I'll tell you what small family farmers want to know as well. They want to know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is going to be there for them. My opponent has said, quote, that he favors abolishing the Federal Department of Agriculture. Well, if you abolish the Federal Department of Agriculture, you know what? You abolish the system that gives us a sustainable farm economy from year to year to year and lifts up net farm income. If you do away with the Farm Bill, guess what else happens? Rand Paul's trying to pull one over on you. You do away with the Farm Bill, 3/4 of the Farm Bill goes to school nutrition programs. That's 500,000 Kentucky kids on free and reduced lunch in our public schools. I'm not for that.
Mr. Paul, you now have 90 seconds.
It's a little hard to figure out what his position is on the tax. Now, he was for them before he was against them, before he was for them. In April this year, we debated at the Farm Bureau, and he came out and told the press he was for bringing back the death tax. He was for bringing back the estate tax. Now, he was going to have a few exemptions, and it wasn't going to be quite as bad as what we had before, but he believed in the concept of bringing back the death tax. In an editorial board, in a major paper in our state, he told them he was for letting the majority of the Bush tax cuts expire. I have no earthly idea what his real position is. Kentucky can't stand to have this kind of ambivalence. You need to know where people stand. I've taken a pledge to permanently repeal the death tax, not for a year, not for 2 years, or whatever today's position is. Permanently repeal it, because I don't believe you should tax people simply for the act of dying. With regard to all the other allegations, it's kind of like running against something that's imaginary, because all these imaginary positions come forward. For getting rid of the Department of Agriculture, not my position, never said it. On and on, these fictitious positions come up because he wants to run against something, but he doesn't want to run and talk about President Obama. He doesn't want to talk about his support for President Obama and all of President Obama's initiatives. That's what this election is about, and he's trying to run away from it.
Mr. Conway, you have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
Not only is Rand Paul wrong for Kentucky, he's wrong about me on this issue. I was consistent on this position. In 2002, I actually supported President Bush's tax cuts, and I'm for extending them now. And I see him over there doing his little waffling thing, and it's kind of cute. But I tell you what, I'm not for extending the special interest provisions of the Bush tax cuts, the tax cuts that ship our jobs overseas. And I know he wants to talk about President Obama, but I bet he'll try to say President Obama more than he's already said $2,000 deductible for Medicare, but he's going to have to say it a bunch to catch up.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Before the next questioning, just a reminder, ladies and gentlemen, we are encouraging you to remain silent so that this process can proceed unimpeded. Scott Reynolds of Wave 3 has the next question for Mr. Paul.
Mr. Paul, Congress has done a couple of things recently to try to make loans easier for businesses to get and make it a better deal for them financially if they purchase equipment. But I just talked with a couple of Louisville business owners yesterday who said they don't want the loans, they're not buying the equipment right now. They're worried about taxes, health care, and added regulations on their businesses. What is going to get the unemployment rate back down into the 5–6% range in this country to get those businesses hiring all the unemployed people who are watching tonight?
The first thing we have to realize is we're doing all the wrong things.